Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited. As some of you know, I was at Curl for my graduate school years from 2000 to 2005, and I enjoyed all of it. It was wonderful to work at Curl and be in Chicago and be at Loyola. My PhD is in applied social psychology. And at that time, we were at the Water Tower campus. I believe you've since moved up north a bit. But I always fondly remember the times at Curl and what an impact it has had on my career and my orientation towards work. And I started my focus on interpersonal violence and my focus on interpersonal violence among diverse populations while I was there, working with the South Asian community with Chris George. And it really started me to think about how traditional views of domestic violence and services for domestic violence don't really speak to all populations, and the need to then do culturally specific work. So that's what I want to share with you today, some of that work that I've done since Curl, and kind of where I am today. I've put my affiliations down here so you could kind of see the trajectory a little bit, but Loyola you're all familiar with, of course. And then I went on to my postdoc at University of New Hampshire in the Family Research Laboratory. My mentor was Murray Strauss while I was there, and was able to work on an international dating violence study during that time with 32 different countries. And then actually went on to Penn State Harrisburg for my first tenure track position, and was there for 9 years in teaching a community psych program at the master's level and social science at the undergraduate level. And then I was in women's studies for 4 years at the University of Delaware, where they're also starting a center on gender-based violence. And then now, as of this year, I'm at Rutgers. So I'm now talking to you from New Brunswick, New Jersey. And we have recently changed our name for the Center on Violence Against Women and Children to the Center for Research to End Violence, or REV. So that is, that's brand new news as of February. So we are rebranding to be more inclusive and expansive. And so this is a bit of just my, academic homes over the last decade and a half or so. So today I'll share some background, some of the ways I think about victimization work with Latinos, and then I'll share some findings with you on rates, on how cultural variables influence this, and also some prevention and intervention programs that I've started working on that I want to expand. So that's the lineup, and hopefully we have time for all of it. I have a lot of slides. We'll see where we go. Please feel free to say, I want more on this, or I want less on that, or however it strikes your fancy, so that we can make the best out of this time for everybody, okay? So the first thing, why does this do this when I don't want it to? The first thing I want to talk about is just kind of the cultural positioning of Latinos in the US, of the Latinx population. We represent 17% of the US population. And so that is the line that you see going down. And you will see where the Latinx population is overrepresented and underrepresented. And that tells us something about social positioning. And so it's a very youthful population. We have a lower median age than the full population, than the general population. And this is even lower for US born Latinos. It's a fast-growing population. We also represent 50% of the immigrants in the US. And another area of representation is not having health insurance, being incarcerated, living below the poverty line, essential workers, and workers in general. So you see some of the areas in which Latinos are overrepresented. And we know that this growth is happening exponentially. Latinos account for 52% of the growth in the United States over the last decade. And Illinois is one of the top 10 states with Latinos in the US. So where are we underrepresented? Things that actually are related to more power in society here. Congress, those with bachelor's degrees or more, in film and what is represented as US culture, doctors, and then I put the violence research in there just to bring it home to what we're doing. But if you look at overall violence research and then you look at violence research specific to Latinos, it's only 3% of that. So I think that this helps us get a picture of the social positioning. Also, if we want to talk about Latinx populations, we need to talk about diversity because it's obviously not a singular population. And in fact, I would argue that it's a very diverse population. So country of origin, when we talk about Latin America, we're talking about 33 different countries, 20 of which speak Spanish, not all of which speak Spanish. And also the US. So we're talking about Central America, the Caribbean, South America, and Mexico. Generation. So we have people who are Latinos that have been here in what's the US mainland since before Jamestown, right? We have folks who the border crossed them, they didn't cross the border. So very much to the fabric and the foundation of this country. And we have very recent immigrants as well that are first immigrating, and we see changes in those immigration patterns as well as to what countries are predominantly sending folks to the US, the conditions under which that's so. And so there's a lot of diversity in that and a lot of change in that. So we have immigration for labor, we have immigration for political refugees, right? We have Cuban folks, we have the Northern Triangle now is, a sender of folks to the US. And, even though the Latinx population has been part of the US since the beginning, there is this distorted view of a perpetual foreigner, right? Like not quite yet mainstream, right? Even though many have been here for generations on end. This idea of mestizaje is very important. Mestizaje is the idea of racial mixing. And indeed, the Latino population is in fact a mix that is the foundation of it between Europeans and natives in South America and the Caribbean and the African slave trade that came in. And so we have this deep history of racial mixing. We have Indian groups such as Taínos and Aztecs and Mayans and Incans that were met with the colonizers and then the Black slave trade, as I mentioned. There's also a significant Asian influence from trade that has happened that's been documented back to the 1500s. So what we have is a continuum of racial tones that's actually really hard to place in the US racial categorization system, which is based on hypodescent. And so, we could see that in how Latinos answer the census, and other is like a huge response to a racial category. So I actually think this mestizaje is really important in understanding the Latino population. And for this reason, You know, there's a lot of contention around the word Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, you know, all of those terms and which was the proper one to use. But really, you know, there's a researcher at UCLA that uses this term Indo, Afro, Oriental, Ibero-American. All of those different parts of the identity really should be represented when we talk about Latinos. Language. So obviously there's Spanish, there's other languages of the colonizers such as French, Portuguese, and Dutch, and native languages such as Quechua, Quiche, Mam, Garifuna. So we have a lot of different languages as well. And documentation status for the immigrants that are here. And so we have about 23% of immigrants as undocumented among Latinos. And so you could see, you know, I put like the racial categories and language and what people feel comfortable with. So taking all of this social positioning as a background, I think that this influences their victimization experiences and how people respond to victimization. So the context of the position here, I think, is going to influence what are the risk factors for the population, what types of violence they're experiencing, and how they could respond with help-seeking options. And I also think it's really important to look at the strengths that are inherent in the culture, as opposed to having a negative, distorted view about a population that doesn't do justice to its history. So we have to understand that it's a minoritized and racialized population. Risk factors could include things like minority stress, acute financial stress, immigration-related stressors. Types of violence could include things like discrimination. Tactics related to immigration could also be related as a tactic of abuse. Help seeking is influenced by that lack of insurance that I mentioned, the different languages. And so we have to take all of these aspects into account. So some of the framework that I've used to help me think about how all of this connects and actually connects to violence is the social determinants of health from the World Health Organization. So I adopted the model here. So at the broader level, we have things like governance, microeconomic, social, and public policies, right? And societal values, and things that would be pertinent to my work are things like immigration policies, white supremacy, English dominance, nationalism, our sense of nationalism in the US. And then these socioeconomical political context then goes to a social hierarchy related to one's economic position and reinforced by things like power and prestige and discrimination. So here, you know, the status that goes along with being a documented immigrant. And then we have this social hierarchy, and the positioning on the social hierarchy then relates to these intermediary determinants, right? So things that you are exposed to, the exposure and your vulnerability to health compromising conditions. So things like acculturation, levels of social support, these intermediary determinants could influence how you are exposed to violence and how you respond, right? And then at the actual level, what we're looking at then is the health and well-being, which in our case here is exposure to violence, right? And so the takeaway from this to me, right, is that if we want to talk about violence and victimization, we also need to look at the power structure within the US and how that's related to different social positionings. So things like being an immigrant could, being an immigrant, your race, ethnicity, your socioeconomic status, it's going to place folks in different locations with the state overall and with institutions, including health services that would be responsive to violence. So that's kind of my overall orientation. And then what I've looked at within that, I want to share some constructs that I've looked at. Obviously, immigrant status is one of them, but another one is acculturation. So this is a process in which parts of the heritage culture and the receiving culture, so the home culture from the country they're coming from and the US culture, how do those practices, values, and identifications mix? A very traditional view and old-fashioned view is that, well, when you become more accustomed to the US, you lose your heritage culture. And we're arguing against that now, right? That one can both maintain their heritage culture and be part of the mainstream US culture. And maybe that these are different dimensions. So that's something that I've really tried to tease apart in my work. And another term that's important is polyvictimization. So more and more of the work in this field is showing that when you're exposed to one form of violence, you're probably exposed to more than one form of violence. So what I really try to do is have a broad orientation to victimization. So I don't only look at intimate partner violence or only sexual violence, but all of those two things together. As well as like physical assault on the street, all of them I'm looking at together. So we need to think about this term, polyvictimization. And so one way of looking at it is just exposure to multiple forms in the same time period. And other people put like a number on it. Like if you've had more than 4 experiences in a time period, then you would be called a polyvictim. So I've done 3 main national studies on this, just focused on the Latino population. The first one was sexual assault among Latinas, and it was 2,000 women by a phone survey, and looking at their different forms of victimization, their help-seeking responses, looking at some of those culturally relevant factors like acculturation and immigrant status, and what the impact was on them. This was, I believe, 2008. So that was the first study that a colleague and I did, actually a colleague from my postdoc and I, and we both went on to then start looking at teens. And that was an important addition because there's very little on adults, and then you could imagine there's even less on teens. And so what we were able to do is to look at that actually longitudinally. And this was also a phone survey. I'm going to talk to you more about this one because I'm going to share some of the results from this. But I also wanted to give you a breadth of all the types of studies I've done and the different methods that I've used to get this. So the phone surveys are some of the studies that I just mentioned, along with a study on child sexual abuse that I did in Pennsylvania. Most recently is an in-person survey on bias victimization in 3 parts of the United States. Internet surveys, community-based research. I'm going to share some of this. This is the intervention part. I'm going to share some of this towards the end of the presentation. Retrato de mi voz, a photo voice project, and then the victim service providers in Quito, Ecuador. Some qualitative studies looking at service records, which I got my training on with Chris George at Curl back in the day. And then secondary data analysis looking at the National Violent Death Reporting System, another really important question to ask that we don't have a lot of great data on for the Latinx population is about intimate partner homicide. And so I tried to look at that a little bit more closely. Some evaluation work and some interventions. As you could see, the green are Latinx specific. The other work is general population. But of course, I put in my angle on diversity and culture in there all the time. So So about the Davila study, dating violence among Latino adolescents. So we had 1,500 teens at wave 1, and wave 2 followed up with 38% of the sample. You could see the generation difference and how that's related to language by the preferred language of the folks who were answering, the parents and the youth. And we interviewed both to get the parent consent and also the parent perceptions on how their children were doing in school, for example. I'm not going to go through all the details of this because this is just a lot of data, but we asked about the victimization questions. I will show you those because that's important to understanding the results. But then the brief acculturation rating scale for Mexican Americans, which doesn't have anything specific to Mexican Americans, so we used it for Latinos in general. But this, it talks about Anglo orientation and Latino orientation, a help-seeking questionnaire, a brief symptom inventory to look at depression and hostility, how connected one is to their school and how well received. Chris, great question. What age group? So 12 to 18 is the age group. Social support, and then the cultural values scale as well, which we're gonna look at. And here is the mean age was 14.8, and you could see the school breakdown there as well. We have a quarter being immigrants themselves, and then the rest being born here in the US. So what else do I want to say about that? I think that's good. Here we have all of the victimization questions. So as I was getting at, we need to look at a broad range of victimizations, not just one form. And so these are all the different types that we measured. So we have conventional crime, and those are the indicators of conventional crime: child maltreatment, parent-sibling victimization, sexual victimization. And then I took one out according to how they answered all of this, plus the CTS, because for each of these screeners, we asked, who did this to you? And so if it was a dating partner, I put it in the dating violence category, or if they answered anything with the conflict tactic scales in line with that. And then also one screener on stalking. I think we could do better on that, but that was the one question we had on stalking. So what were the rates that we found, right? So here's wave 1 and wave 2, which has been published. So any form of victimization, we have 50% of the teens experiencing one or more of these. So that's it's a high level. It's not higher than any other group, but it is something to really think about. And you know, what are these experiences that they're having early in their life, from, you know, the predominant one being peer and sibling victimization, and the least prevalent one being stalking. And so we see these changes, we see these violence experiences, and that a lot of teens, like I mentioned, had more than one form of violence exposure. So actually 47% had more than one. You could see some changes over the 2 waves. Most of them went down. We do see, right, with age, it does tend to go down a little bit, but we still have a pretty high level. So one of the questions that we have, of course, is, well, how does victimization at wave 1 relate to victimization at wave 2, right? It should be a risk factor for it. So in fact, it is both at cross-sectionally. So dating violence is related to other forms of violence within the same time period, which is that, again, that hitting that same point that you're usually victimized in more than one way, but also that from dating violence at wave 1 to the stuff at wave 2, dating violence increases the risk by a factor of 3.5 for victimization at the next point in time. And what's really interesting to me is if looking at it the other way, if you have dating violence at wave 1, what happens at, if you have other forms of violence at, wave 1, what are the other, what is your risk of dating violence at wave 2? And so you could see here with these significant risk ratios that the risk is compounded significantly when there is conventional crime, child maltreatment, or sexual victimization. So what we see is that these other forms of violence kind of precede dating violence and could be a potential intervention point, right, that would then get at subsequent victimization. Another interesting thing that we can do with the data, which we looked at, was, well, how are these things linked with each other, right? So I keep on saying that if you have one form, you're more likely to have another form. What we did is we used a latent class analysis, okay? So that took, it's a statistical method to take all of these different forms, right? And then look at how they clump together, which are the ones that are linked with each other, okay? And what we did to look at these linkages, we wanted to see who the type of perpetrator was, okay? And what type of violence it was. So if it was a dating perpetrator, an adult that was a non-family member, like a neighbor or a friend, an adult family member, so a parent or an aunt or uncle, a peer non-family member, or a juvenile family member, like a cousin, a sibling. And then what type of violence, physical, sexual, stalking, and psych. So we broke that down for every person. And then we saw how they grouped together in a latent class, okay? So the first thing that we know is about half are just uninvolved in any kind of victimization. But then we have these two classes that represent 6.5% and then 15.5% respectively. One is just psychological dating violence. So what we saw among this group is they really didn't have any other experiences except the psychological dating violence. It's not to minimize it, but it's, that's how their experiences clumped together. Another group had also psychological victimization. This one was predominant by peers and some other folks in their lives, as well as adults and juveniles. So these two profiles are focused on psychological violence and differentiating on who it's coming from. The next two profiles are focused on physical violence, one by juvenile family members, so, siblings or cousins, and then one by peers. This one also included a percentage of adult non-family perpetrators, so friends of the family, for example, or a teacher in the community, a community member, something like that. So we have these classes, and what we can see is that when you look at the specific data on this, that they're getting a number of these children are being victimized by various people in their lives in different contexts. So, both in their neighborhood and at school, in their family and in their neighborhood, those types of overlaps. And in fact, we had one group that was just all about that. Multi-form victimization by multiple perpetrators. And their likelihood of having some form of victimization by any of these folks was elevated. And so, this is a different way. This is a person-centered way as opposed to a variable-centered way of looking at the victimization experiences. I think it's really helpful in understanding what are the different kind of groups of folks that that experience victimization. Another thing I've really been interested in is further expanding intersectionality by looking at sexual minority Latinx youth. And so we know that the LGBTQ population in general is at an increased risk of bullying and other forms of victimization. But I wanted to see what this was like for the Latinx population. We don't have a lot of data on it. We were trying to, use the data that we have to look at this question. And in fact, we were able to do that. So when we looked at the levels of victimization for the population, when we categorized people as sexual minority or heterosexual according to either who they dated or who they were attracted to, we can see a difference here in victimization levels. Pretty much for every single one of these, the sexual minority youth are experiencing more victimization than other Latinx youth. And the ones that are significant here, I have marked with a star at the bottom: dating violence, sexual violence, and polyvictimization. Those are the ones that are significantly different. And you can imagine that sexual violence and polyvictimization, for example, are related to more severe psychological consequences. They're a more severe type of abuse, or potentially more. Dating violence having that effect on obviously their intimate relationships and also the trajectories of violence. When you looked at the Latinx sexual minority youth, they had more psychological distress than the heterosexual Latinx youth, and they had less social support. So, some of the things that we can expect that, we would expect given the positioning around being a sexual minority and the stigma around it. But it's still it still hurt to see it laid out so bare about, lack of support from their family, from their partner. So some of the next level of questions that I asked is, well, is it the demographics that is related to the extent of victimization among sexual minority and Latinx youth, or is it something about their lack of support and the psychological distress associated with being a sexual minority? So what I did is I did a stepwise multivariate regression. And in the first step, looked at the demographic variables. I put in age, being a girl, socioeconomic status, immigrant, and being a sexual minority. So these demographic markers. When we put in the demographic markers, yes, there is a significant relationship between being a sexual minority and having a high level of victimization. So it is a risk factor. Being a sexual minority is a risk factor. But when we then add in the psychosocial variables of social support, depression, psychological functioning, these things, guess what? Sexual minority is no longer significant, right? So my takeaway from this is that it's not the sexual minority status that's harmful. It is the lack of social support and the stigma that comes along with being a sexual minority that is harmful in the sense of being related to more victimization. But in and of itself, it does not account for higher levels of victimization or more severe amounts of victimization. Another question that I'm interested in, of course, is about what can help teens over time. So I'm switching from the sexual minority stuff and looking at one of the things that we would think that helps folks related to this, obviously, is social support, right? Shouldn't social support over time be related to less victimization? And so we were able to look at this in this model. And it has a lot of components. So let me walk you through it first. So what we have here, this is called a cross-lagged model. We have wave 1 victimization and wave 1 social support, right? And we have wave 2 victimization and wave 2 social support. And these two things should be linked, right? They should be linked within the time period. But the questions that we have is, well, wave 1 social support should be connected to wave 2 social support, when that makes sense, and wave 1 victimization being related to wave 2 victimization. But here's where the real question is. How does wave 1 victimization relate to social support over time? And how does wave 1 social support relate to wave 2 victimization? Is it protective, right? So this is what we were able to look at, and I will start us off, hopefully, with the simpler of these things. Okay, so yes, these things are related over time. So is victimization related over time, and social support is protective cross-sectionally. That is wonderful, right? So it is helpful to have this social support. What we want to see here is what happens in the middle. And I have a little bit of bad news here. In the middle, we have social support at wave 1. Oh, where did it go? Is not significantly related to victimization at time 2. So it's not protective over time. It's only protective cross-sectionally. And in fact, we see what they call a deterioration of social support coming from victimization. So if folks are victimized at time 1, we see a deterioration of social support at time 2. So what are some of the implications of this? I think for this whole section about rates and kind of the layout of victimization, that we need a more comprehensive assessment of victimization. We can't just stay with one form. We know that more than half experienced at least one form. We see victimization across different settings. So focusing on either one type of victimization or one type of perpetrator is just not sufficient to understand what's going on. These person-centered approaches, like in the latent class analysis, are very helpful for understanding the heterogeneity of experiences. And then the victimization experiences change over time, but some forms are more closely associated with high risk, like having that child maltreatment at an early stage in life is much more related than to subsequent victimization. We see that polyvictimization isn't a unitary construct, but a multidimensional construct, and the different forms of victimization that could happen vary. So we need to look at that also in more detail. Maybe it seems that there's more than one form of polyvictimization. And we also need to look at multiple dimensions of identity and the related stigma that comes with that, along, for example, with the sexual minority status. So are there any questions? I have more, but does anybody have any questions on this particular part that they want to? So did child maltreatment include witnessing? Let me confirm that. I think it's no, but I want to confirm for you. No, it did not. So if we included that, obviously we would have higher levels of victimization, but what we had was physical abuse directly by a caregiver, psychological, emotional abuse from a caregiver, or neglect. Those were the 3 things that we included under child maltreatment. I think we could see even stronger relationships if we did include witnessing, because that's also a high risk experience in childhood. So moving on to the next section, looking at cultural adaptation and how does that relate to victimization. So when we look at cultural adaptation, we could look at things like practices, their language, foods. We could look at values like collectivism or familialism, and identification with both cultures. And what I've looked at mostly in my work is immigrant status, Anglo orientation, Latino orientation, and family support. So the first thing I want to share with you is how many immigrants versus US born Latinos experience victimization. And we have a common misperception that immigrants are the most victimized and are most engaged with some form of violence. That's not what I found in any of my studies. All of my studies have found that immigrants actually have lower levels of victimization, and US born Latinos have higher levels of victimization, which you can see here. The ones that were significant starred for you, and the ones that were marginally significant with the plus mark. You could see some of the differences here across this. And so, you know, one of the things that I want to know is, of course, what's driving this, right? Is it what is helpful about being an immigrant that allows lower levels of victimization? It's still victimization. There still needs to be immigrant-specific Latino services, but it's a lower level than US-born Latinos. And so what I've looked at in multivariate models here is things like family support and being an immigrant and Anglo orientation or Latino orientation. How do those things relate to your victimization experiences, which is across the top? And what you can see by and large, of course, is that familial support is the main thing here. This is the main story, that the more support and connection that you have to your family, the lower the odds are of any of these forms of violence. You know, immigrant status is protective as well, and Anglo orientation and Latino orientation, but the predominant thing going on here is about familial support. And what I wanted to do even further than this is look at the interactions between the different dimensions of acculturation. So for example, how does Anglo orientation work differently for immigrants versus non-immigrants? Does Latino orientation work differently for immigrants versus non-immigrants? So I wanted to look at that. And so we did 2- and 3-way interactions, which really broke my head. But here are the 2-way interactions that came out significant, and there's stuff to talk about here. So the dark lines are if you're high in Latinx orientation, okay? And the lighter lines is when you are low in Latinx orientation. So when Latino orientation is high, those dark lines, those dark green lines, as Anglo orientation increases, probability of victimization decreases. You could see all of these lines go down. So for the high Latino folks, as they get more high Anglo, we see a decrease in victimization. What does that mean? That the lowest ones are those that have high Anglo and high Latino. Who are those folks? Those are the bicultural folks, right? So biculturalism is a positive thing for youth, okay? Where we don't see a relinquishing of heritage cultures, where we see a maintenance of Latino culture, but we also see adaptation to the mainstream US culture. And those are the folks that across these different forms of victimization actually have the lowest risk. This is a little bit different than what I find for adults. What I find for adults is that having a Latino orientation is protective and having an Anglo orientation is a risk factor. There could be differences about the time of immigration or the experiences that they're having. These are youth, and they're on the main acculturative structure that we have in the US, the school system, you know. And so we really see the benefits here of youth being bicultural. We could think about the importance of youth being bilingual and how that's related to a decrease in the risk of victimization. So what are my takeaway points on acculturation and this stuff? If we want to support children, we need to support families, right? That familial support was so important across all of these different forms of victimization. Trying to treat children apart from trying to help families is limited in its scope, right? Cultural adaptation is beneficial. The importance of biculturalism and bilingualism. How can we foster these things in prevention and intervention approaches? And that there's really complex relationships at play, especially for sexual victimization. I didn't get into that. I had one significant three-way interaction, and it was for sexual victimization. And so this idea of cultural affinity, cultural affirmation, not having that negative orientation towards what Latinos are like in the US, that, you know, back to that kind of orientation that I gave you at the beginning of the presentation, those building the strengths is what helps the youth the most. So resilience and intervention programs, hopefully in 10 minutes. I don't know about that, but we'll see what we can do. Okay, so resilience is about overcoming adversity, right? And it's a play between risk and protective factors. And so what we want to see with resilience is typical or even great developmental outcomes despite adversity. Resources obviously are going to help the likelihood of one having showing resilience, and resources can be at the individual, relational, or collective level. And in our case, of course, resilience here is going to be about not having as poor psychological functioning despite having victimization experiences. So they have the victimization experiences, but perhaps they're still functioning well psychologically. We know that other studies find that things that are protective include relationships with caregivers, a powerful sense of oneself, of self-competency, recognition of one's skills, efficacy, social justice, a sense of social justice, resources, material resources, a sense of belonging. Okay, and so we're able to group these into individual, relational, and collective. So what I looked at here as an indicator of these resources is familialism. So the sense of connection with a family, placing high levels of importance on family, social support, and school connectedness, okay? So things like school, where school connectedness were like things like adults listen to me, the principal takes my ideas seriously, the rules are fair, I don't waste time in classes, like I feel part of, I feel respected here. And there's also a structure here that allows me to feel safe. And that is actually what we see as a main protective factor here for psychological well-being despite victimization. And again, looking at these interactions, well, does the school connectedness, does that work the same for everyone, whether you have high or low levels of victimization? And so we did an interaction analysis here, and it's really interesting. This is not what I would expect, but it's actually The heavy lines here is high school connectedness. And for the high school connectedness, as DV goes up, depression and anxiety goes down. So what this means is that the school connectedness actually is more beneficial for those with high levels of victimization than those with low levels of victimization. So it helps the most victimized. This is actually a pattern that's found in resilience research. It's called a protective enhancing effect. Okay, so things like feeling listened to, having opportunities to express ideas, these are the things that enhance well-being. And what I'm thinking of, the way I interpret this, is perhaps that this is a cascading effect. So at high levels of victimization, perhaps the school becomes more involved, maybe other parts, maybe they're triggering other forms of support, and like peers or parents. And so that those with the high levels of victimization then and high school school connectedness maybe get more attention, right? And then therefore have these positive consequences, I guess, at this point for those that are victimized. Okay, and what I also want to share with you now is outside of the Davila study, everything I've talked about right now has been related to the dating violence among Latino adolescents study. But what I want to talk to you now about is some of the more recent work that I've been doing, trying to infuse culture into intervention programs. And so the first one, there's two that I want to share with you. The first one is called integrative community therapy. This is an approach that comes out of Brazil that's used to bring people together literally in a circle. In this case, it was on a Zoom box, but you know, we're going to pretend that as it was intended to be in person pre-COVID, that it brings people together. It's non-hierarchical. It infuses culture and things like cultural traditions, songs into the methodology. And it says, what's bothering you? What issues do you have? What keeps you up at night? And then a person shares about that, and others share how they dealt with that specific instance as well. And so what we did here, which is unusual because a lot of this has been used in lots of different areas, but not so much with intimate partner violence. So we recruited intimate partner violence survivors in Quito, Ecuador. We did a pre-post comparison group design. We had 49 in the intervention group and 38 in the comparison group, and we measured them over time on DV attitude, social support, health and well-being, self-esteem and resilience. And then we also had some open-ended questions there at the end. We do see significant changes. This is pre and post. Sorry, the legend is in Spanish, but the pre and post is a pre and post. And then we could see the comparison group, in some cases improving, but the intervention group improving substantially more, right? So health and well-being really went up for them. Self-esteem went up for them, even though they started at a significantly lower level. It just shot right up over this 6-week period with a group of DV survivors talking to each other about their experiences over Zoom. And social support, you could see how that shot up as well, really high for the intervention group. And we see in the qualitative part, we really got to look at some of the experiences that they said they had as a result. There were changes in the relationship with the aggressor. Many already you were out of the relationships. In fact, we tried to recruit for people that were out of the relationship, but there were cases in which there was still some contact. And the women said that they were able to put more limits, increase the distance with their aggressor during this intervention. Thanks to this study, I have been able to keep my distance from the aggressor. In addition, I have strengthened my self-esteem and not allowed him to manipulate me. There was a main theme about emotional changes that happened during the process of increase in self-confidence and self-love and hope. The idea that they could overcome violent relationships, releasing guilt. I believe that this workshop, of which I've been a part, helped me to embark on a path of many things. I have realized mistakes that I have made, and that more than anything, I have lacked self-love. I realized that I have to learn to forgive myself. I've made mistakes. That's life, right? In other words, the important thing is to move forward and to improve as human beings. So I take all of that with me, and it has served me a lot. It has motivated me a lot to see life differently, with more optimism, with more positivity. So that's one of the examples. This idea of not feeling alone was huge. So those changes in social support, the circles and the music workshop have allowed me to share my experiences, let me know that I'm not alone, and has proven that talking heals. So we see that. And then if you would, if I could just go on a little longer, like 4 or 5, okay, good. We see another example of trying to use, I would say, non-traditional approaches that potentially could work for the Latino population. I've used photo voice with a domestic violence sexual assault center in Reading, Pennsylvania, which is more rural, but it's one of the areas that has now skyrocketed over the last decade or two with Latinos. And they were having trouble outreaching to the Latina population in their community. And so we did a project where Latina survivors shared their experiences. What do you want the DV agency to know about your story, about your experiences? Kind of what are we missing? And we gave them cameras to document that. And we met with them over 6 weeks. Same group again and again. It was only 9 women. But we met with them, talked about their experiences. They had all gone through traditional services, but there was still more that they wanted to express. And so we used the photo voice to allow them to express that. So the idea of photo voice is for participants to capture and convey their own images about their community needs, strengths, and story. And that this should help us understand and address disparities in vulnerable communities. And it breaks down the power imbalance because it is someone talking about themselves and sharing their own stories, as opposed to us coming in as external folks with an agenda. So I also coded the things that they talked about in the groups. They met for an hour and a half to 2 hours every week. I coded that, what they talked about with the images. And these are the themes that they talked about: discrimination and fighting misconceptions. They acknowledged that they lived marginalized identities, and they talked about the discrimination they faced. Some of this was about being a woman and being Latino, facing oppression in the US, not being understood or not understanding the mainstream culture, institutions of higher education looking down on them and people in their family. And then they seek as a mission, these women in particular, to fight these stereotypes, right? I know in Reading High, a lot of teen moms get bashed and judged and talk about, they're just gonna go and stay on welfare. and they're going not to do anything with their lives. And I just wanted to prove that I was more than a statistic. I wanted to prove that just because you are a young woman, a mother, doesn't mean you can't chase your dreams or that you don't want to. They also talked about other forms of abuse that they experienced, a range of forms of abuse, some of which maybe fall under the purview of the Sexual Assault DV agency, maybe some that don't. But they talked about all of these different experiences. And we could see just the broad range, the level of severity. And they also talked about other stressors that do fall outside the traditional purview, like loss of a grandson or being adopted, financial strain. And so we see that these levels of high stress, and this is how they captured that as, being pecked on, being that roadkill, I guess, and having all of those stresses on them. Here's another one that really gets at the level of brutality and stress that the women have lived through. And this is how she wanted to portray her own story. They talked about support, both in a positive and negative way, how wonderful it was that to get, to have a sense of security in the groups, that they've come to know this place, that they've come to meet these others in the group. And now, they never dreamed of something like that. But they also talk about, the put downs and the lack of support that they got from their families, and how that helped, I guess, created a lack of trust in others over time. And here's some of the support. I've never had a woman figure to look up to, but there was one person who was my hero. My hero was and always will be my nursing teacher, who walked me across the stage to receive my award at the competition. There was a lot of emphasis, on the aspirations and accomplishments that they want. They wanted so much more for their lives. Education was a main thing that a lot of folks really focused on and wanted to advance with, and doing it despite all the stuff that's been thrown at them. I'm a single mom. I go to college full time. I work part time. I don't have help from my daughter's father, and still I made my dreams come true. So this real sense of grit, perseverance, moving past. This is growth, right? This is what we would hope that happens after one lives through these horrible experiences and is able to reclaim their lives. Look at the smile and the sense of pride on her face in front of the Reading Area Community College, right? You could just feel it. This says, don't let your dreams fade away, diminish, rot, because you are more strong than everything else. This one says, I always dreamed of my vision. Then one day I woke up and made a vision board, and now my dreams are coming true. They talked a lot about coping, of finding their own voice, no longer keeping quiet, right? I feel a little relief because I kind of let it out, but I feel great. I feel that it's great to be able to share as a group and to inform the purpose, and to stay pushing forward. This is, some of the points of strength for the women: music and art. This center where they spend a lot of time in childhood, And then having this sense of growth and recovery, setting limits. They talked about changing their story, you know, like, this is my past, but I am going to change the future of my story. That past is not going to own me. Beginning again, moving on, forgiveness, enjoyment, making good decisions now. When they hurt you, you discovered that you were made of gold and you could transform and be a beautiful and free being. Right. And so they painted gold on their face to represent their brokenness, but also that in that brokenness is gold. It is their treasure. And this one I love. This is a sexual assault survivor. She said, I didn't have a childhood. So now that I am able to love myself and to have a loving relationship, now I get to play. And so she went right on the playground and played now. So looking at all of those, I think connection seems to be the main takeaway, right? How can we build those senses of connection, both for the Latino teens in their schools? How do they feel seen, known, and cared for? How do we use healing in the group formats? Both of the interventions that I showed you are group formats. I think that this is helpful in the community, in the Latino community, to use a group format, to play up and respect the cultural values and tradition, and to really go and look at the person holistically, not just the past victimization experiences, but what do they want to aspire to? What are their overall goals? And this tends to go beyond traditional services in the field that tend to focus on crisis, and rightly so. We need to focus on crisis services, but what's after the crisis? How can we help with restoration, right? So those are my overall points. Moving forward, I want to look more beyond acculturation. I want to look at some of the structural conditions and how that's related, how discrimination is related to responses to a victimization. I want to look at other forms of victimization. So I keep on talking a lot about polyvictimization, but what we see is other forms of violence that aren't included in this conversation, such as self-directed violence or bias victimization, that we really haven't included. And of course, to continue working on culturally relevant prevention and intervention programs, so that we can work to combat some of these negative consequences. So that is my spiel, and I hope that you got some useful information, and I'd be happy to talk.
Thanks so much, Chiara. We'll just invite folks to unmute. If you want to raise your hand, you can, but just go ahead and unmute. And we're an intimate crowd today, so I see Christine's already unmuted, so I will look to Christine.
Yeah, I mean, this was wonderful. I really got a lot of ideas and strength from it, and I remember, I don't know if you remember when we did the presentation on the Apnagar study, and the lessons that we learned looking at immigrant women, South Asian women, and the services being provided for them. And I remember at the end, and I think it was actually Leslie, who's also on this call, and was in the audience at that time working for the city, and saying that in a lot of ways, what we found reiterated the early days of the domestic violence movement, and sort of a community-based sort of collective supportive approach. And I feel that a lot of your research also harkens back to that, and harkens back to the importance, of of the support groups, of the peer-to-peer work, and of the importance of community support. And the other thing I want to say, to me, the strength in your data about, you know, people who are bicultural, and sort of keeping both, you know, your culture of heritage and the American culture, and putting that together, I thought was very, very strong, you know.
Yeah.
And it really, you know, I mean, it resonated for me as a child of immigrants, you know, and but yeah, I would really like to see a lot more work on that, you know. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah, and how do we build that into prevention and intervention programs? You know, that's the trick. So I don't know. I mean, it could be Spanish language, but that's not, it's more than language, you know. It's definitely, I think, honoring the diverse experiences that people have, the wisdom of the generations before us, you know, and that continuity and connection to something greater. And that's hard because, you know, the racial formation process also goes through different stages, including, you know, rejecting your heritage culture for some teens, you know, and so it's a process in both senses, right? About the cultural, you becoming comfortable with your cultural identity as well, right? And then having an intervention that both feeds on both heritage and U.S. cultures. So, yeah.
I want to say something else before I forget it. It's just that one of the things when looking at sort of the difference, the resiliency of more recent immigrants to people who were born in the United States, on a number of factors, I keep on thinking of the, I mean, I'm sure the work is being done, but when I was doing in the 80s and 90s infant mortality work, and you saw that recent immigrants, that the infant mortality rates controlling for economic issues and all of that were just a lot lower, and the morbidity and mortality rates for the children, and the use of breastfeeding, all of those things were just, those children were so much hardier than the second generation, the children of second generation immigrants, or of people who have been for many, many years in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, on a slew of health outcomes, you see this. I mean, the term that's used in it, the immigrant paradox, right? So, you know, we have it. One of the theories around it is the Salmon hypothesis. Like, those that come to the U.S. are probably a bit stronger in some way, maybe have more resources, and so we might be picking up on some of those differences when we see that. But it's really compelling to try to understand why that's so, because I mean, I see it in violence, infant mortality, smoking, hypertension. I mean, you have it in so many different areas. Yeah.
Others, questions, reactions?
Or just career life questions too, because I was at Curl and now I'm teaching somewhere else.
Well, I would like, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, you go.
Hi, my name is Lena Killian, and I am an instructor at Loyola's nursing program. But I did 2 years of community outreach. And what I did was I provided prenatal classes and education to pregnant teens and their partners. And so I really appreciated what you said, and it just gives me food for thought, because I had couples who were anywhere from the age of 13 to 18, and I had as many as 25 and the majority of my young ladies were Latina.
Mhm.
And one thing I wish, after listening to you, one thing that I do wish is that I wish I had more time to understand their backstory.
Mm, mhm.
Because I found that I'm a person that loves to, and I'm also an immigrant. I came here, I wasn't born in this country, didn't speak English. I totally understand the child's point of view, as well as the immigrant's point of view. Self-efficacy
Mm,
and building on their self-efficacy, I think really helped strengthen my ladies. And I call them ladies because they're just, oh my gosh, beautiful, beautiful,
mm,
strong. But it helped me to build a bond with them and a trust where they did start to come to me towards the end. And I've noticed that looking for, I don't even know if saying, you know, like someone to just put their wings around them and say, it's okay.
mm.
I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to help you. I'm here to help you grow. And what is it that I can do for you? What do you need from me? So that they have the ability to utilize their voice and express themselves, and know that there are other, you know, they're limited by their age, they're limited by their life experiences and what they're seeing, what others are doing, and therefore their perspective is very narrowed. So I just wanted to say thank you. You got my brain going. You got my brain going.
So did you, likewise.
So,
Thank you for sharing that experience.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you for joining us today. And yes, the synapses in my brain. How did you put it, Chiara? One of the three-way interactions kind of breaks your brain.
Yeah.
Trust me, when you would break my brain a lot earlier on the stats, but just the kind of experiences and just the ways that it's connecting in my head, at least at the moment, to some of the things that we have done at Curl, that we are doing, our community partners. This has been thought-provoking, and I appreciate the reflections. Leslie, you had.
I just wanted to follow up. Thank you very much. I learned a lot. I appreciate it. And having had exposure as a community partner to the research that's done at Curl, I know what some of those methods actually mean now, that I didn't before. They have like opened up my brain and shoved that stuff in, so I can't just pretend like I don't care or know. So I found that very interesting. But I really wanted to sort of follow up on Chris's comment, which was, as you were talking about the helpful interventions, I was having a little moment, because all I could think about was that's exactly what we did in the early days of domestic violence work that was coming out of the feminist model. And the idea was to get women who had had those experiences, those shared experiences, together in a room, let them know they were believed, let them talk to one another, identify the commonality of the experience. And I think what your research indicates is that those goals, with the heightened attention to the shared experience of being Latino, in how that is conducted, really can have genuine and long-term benefits to not just the immediate help, but the overall well-being of people who have experienced victimization. And so it's like, okay, we knew that, we let that go. And now we need to get back to that, because so much of it now is individual treatment and court-based services with little attention to the ongoing support, So I just wanted to tell you that it struck a chord in me on that. And the only other comment I would like to know if you thought about was the question that I did ask, which is the existence of domestic violence occurring between the parents of teen dating violence perpetrators, for lack of a better term, those who cause that harm, and victimization. I would really like to see that link, because we make a lot of suppositions about that. And I think it goes in two directions. I think some people mirror it, and I think some people run from it like crazy. And I think a lot of that has to do with resiliency. So
Mhm.
those were the sort of the intersectional things that I was thinking about as a non-researcher per se, just like to play one on TV.
Well, these are
I
great.
enjoyed
Thank you.
it.
Thank you so much for those comments and observations. And yeah, I'm right in line with what you're thinking. These are the ways that I want to move forward. So the pilot study that I showed you in Ecuador, I want to look to, I mean, I'm looking at that as a pilot study to then, leverage some more funding, hopefully, and work with maybe Spanish speakers in the US here. This methodology really hasn't been used in the US. It's been used in Brazil, and it's been used, some in other parts of South America, but very little outside. So I would like to incorporate that and seek more funding for that. And I think that your argument is, I mean, that's an argument to make, that we need some more grassroots, look you in the face, get to know each other, and go back to those roots. And that's where that consciousness raising comes from. And that is part of the process. They use the consensitization from Freire in their linking of this, of the theoretical foundation for this methodology. So, but it's the same idea, right? It's that reflecting and having that developing that critical consciousness about one's life in a group format, that really, in their way of thinking, it debunks some of these power differentials that we have, the professionalization that we have, and even they say, that this is that the treatment models that we have are colonial in their approach, right? So this is a way to decolonize. So I'm really looking forward to trying to make that argument and hopefully getting more funding for it. And the other one about child maltreatment, you're right. We don't have a lot of data on that exposure for the Latino youth, but that is something I could possibly do something about in my next study. So the next study, I'm working on a proposal now, hopefully to do in this cycle, but an intersectional examination of Latinas, to look at the original study I did over a decade ago now, replicate it, but then really look at this intersectionality of queer, trans, disabled, elder, farm worker, Latinas, and to look at those intersections, because we can't just make Latina one unitary concept, So I'm really looking to put that together, and I could think about including some exposure to IPV questions in that.
Fascinating. Any final questions or thoughts? Otherwise, Chiara, I will leave it to you to.
I just have one.
Okay, Christine, I knew I could
Little
count
one.
on.
I just want to say, Chiara, that in public health, and especially infant mortality, and prenatal care, that there's a whole method called centering. And that actually, has received, it's received a lot of, you can get funding. It's one of the certified kinds of things that you can do. And what they do is it's centering around, like, you could go in for diabetes. They have all the diabetes patients come in at the same time when they're seeing the doctor, and then they talk about commonality of health problems with that. It started with, prenatal and then postnatal care. And yeah, and so I can get you more stuff on that or connect you to that. But when you were talking about the stuff in keto, it reminded me of that.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining me this space for an hour and a half and hearing all of this stuff and your great comments and feedback. So
Thank you. It was great to have you back. Someday soon, we hope to have you to join us in person. That'd be nice. And as always, Chiara, we're happy to partner with you. You've gone on to, no surprise to us, you've gone on to do great work, and love to continue partnerships with you.
Same here.
Thank you all, and have a wonderful weekend.